One of the subjects you touched on was CAD programming. Now I'd like to get more in depth and have all the artists discuss the use of CAD in their practice. Who would like to go first? Nico?
Sure. So I think my process of how I design my stuff has changed drastically in the last few years. I mean, the last year actually. Before I used to basically print simple cylinders and see how if I include sort of, let's say, glitches into either the program or as it's printing, whether there would be major differences from one object to the next. However, recently I've been trying to dwell more into more fully realized forms, and even though that there are, I still leave elements of chance, elements of me not fully knowing how the object will become. I still sort of design with a clear vision, and I start designing using Rhino, and I take Rhino is also, it's not free, but you can try it on a 90-day trial. And I designed the basic form, and then I moved to another program, which is Blender, the same one Jonathan Key mentioned. And I add detail, I make it look from something more rigid into something more organic. So there's this sort of multi-level transformation of an object, making it look less rigid and more organic.
Great. Fred, how does CAD work in your practice?
So I predominantly use the Fusion suite of products. Mesh Mixer is also, I think, a free one, and it's quite a visual bit of software. It also has a relatively limited set of functionality because these softwares can get incredibly complex to use. And I am often taking individual geometries and combining them. So I'll take something like one ellipsoid, I will duplicate it a number of times. I will essentially build up forms using that and then combine them into one individual shape. And then at that point, I'll send it to the slicer. Something which I've done a little bit more recently is actually designing in a software like Mesh Mixer and then exporting it to Fusion 360 and slicing it individually in that software and then offsetting the slices. And then that's quite an interesting thing to see how the slicing software interprets that. You get some quite interesting variation there. There's also ZBrush, which is a more sculptural product, software, which I don't use as much because there's quite a steep learning curve on that, but that really opens up, and I think you use that quite a lot as well, Nico.
Yeah, I've been using it quite recently. I think that sort of, it offers a way to sculpt things like you would sculpt in clay, but use either the cursor or your tablet. Blender also offers this type of sculpting. However, I find it more comfortable to do it in ZBrush recently. ZBrush is not free though, so that's the difference.
Heleen, can I hear what you use CAD in your practice?
Saying Rhino, but I have to say I'm extremely bad in CAD. So what I really try to use as primitive as possible, and really then also try to anticipate on the materiality of the pieces, because and for me in clay there's so many different parameters. So now I'm doing a whole series of just cylinders, and then just playing with different quantities and gradations of clay, it ends up in totally different organic shapes. So I'm keeping it quite simple to really understand the materiality in a more parametric way.
Great. And Ryan, what about CAD in your practice?
Yeah, for me, I think it's definitely a learning curve. I think going from throwing and being quite tactile, you might sketch a shape or draw a shape, but really it comes down to using your hands and forming a shape. And then to step over to something that's like now digital, you really have to think about, what is that form that you want to create? And I think as artists, we all use CAD in very different ways, whereas algorithms or mashing up shapes and pushing it together. And I think that's what's actually really interesting as well. I mean, there's so many programs out there, and it takes a lot of time to learn these programs. I think as people that are really good at understanding clay as a body, but then also understanding technical side of CAD design, and you really need a bit of knowledge of both to a certain level to be able to produce some goods. And I'm still very much learning CAD and morphing 2 shapes and 3 shapes together and creating different forms.
Right. That brings me to, like, how do you find these programs? If someone's getting started in 3D printing, say they want to get a machine, how would they look for a type of program, and where would they look online, or what would be a good source?
Yeah, there's so many different types of CAD programs, and used in so many different industries. So, you know, architecture, there's architectural ones, there's SketchUp. I don't think many people use much SketchUp here. I'm not sure, but I actually use quite a lot of SketchUp. And yeah, just research in terms of 3D CAD design. I think there's a lot of different free software out there as well as paid as well. And Rhino is probably a good one as well, but very complex. And SketchUp's more basic.
Did you find the free ones very good? Because I know Jonathan mentioned earlier that he, you know, sort of exclusively uses those, but is there much more of a benefit over paid programs?
I think there is. I mean, maybe not so much in the ceramic world and in 3D printing clay, but I think architecture and things. But Blender's probably a good one to start with. I know Jonathan mentioned that earlier.
Okay, great. And now, Michelle, could you tell us about your use of CAD?
Yeah, I think as a maker of materials, and you know, that obsessed with material and manipulation of material, I very much approach making intuitively. And I think the free CAD software like Fusion 360 I found very intuitive, and actually that's where I started to progress. And I really enjoyed it, and it's fun. I have a lot to learn, a bit like ceramics, you know, there's more than a lifetime's worth to learn in ceramics, and it's a bit like that for CAD. So it's kind of, I like to try all the free ones and see which intuitively I think works for me. For now, I'm working with Fusion 360, which is free. And also I really like scanning objects, quite lo-fi, and then that as a starting point as CAD as well.
Great. Jonathan, you discussed it briefly, but talk about CAD a little bit with your practice.
Yeah, I kind of need to explain a little bit that I'm really interested in form. So it's a sculptural form. So it's been for me a bit more sort of a conceptual development into all of that, is that I got interested in how I could visualize forms that I would otherwise not make under normal ceramic techniques, you know, sort of thrown or coiled or so and so forth. Working in a CAD program, I was starting to see things, be able to manipulate the form that I'd never done in my ceramic studio before. And then that was linked with this kind of interest in evolution. So I was seeing how scientists were managing to explore that link between natural processes and the way things grow. I mean, so basically, I then taught myself coding, and this is the way I work. So my forms are then generated in code. That I guess could be a way, you know, called a CAD, computer-aided design. Is it? I don't know. Anyway, and then I use the Blender program as my editing program. So a bit like a photographer, you might take a photograph. I generate a 3D form in the code, and then I import it into Blender. And like you might in Photoshop fix up a photograph, I then fix up the 3D model. So my CAD program or drawing program is Blender.
Okay, great. Looks like everyone has a slightly different approach to their practice.
Yeah.
The next thing, I guess, one of the most important things as in 3D clay printing is the printer. So I want to talk about printers. I know some of you use WAS, some use Luton. So if you could talk about the printers you use and maybe the adaptation of the equipment and what you've had to do to use it in your practice. Who would like to go first? Fred?
I'll start, yeah. I guess I've been very fortunate in that working for Goldsmiths, they have bought the Luton, which is, you know, something which is pre-made, and a really reliable device. Before that, I know that Jonathan had released the files for the self-build Delta, which is fantastic, and I didn't quite have the kind of mechanical engineering skills to put one of those together. But the Luton has been a really good device. It's a Cartesian design, I think, and it's cartridge loaded, which distinguishes it from a few other designs. The idea being that you can load individual cartridges which brings the clay closer to the point of extrusion, which is quite an important thing when printing, because it allows, I think, for sort of slightly easier flow of clay. So we've had really good experience with the Lutum.
Right.
Yeah.
Heleen, what about the printer in your practice?
Jonathan, I have to thank you for all your amazing documentation, because I used that one of the Wiki Factory on 3D printing. So I was lucky enough to buy an Anycubic Delta printer, and then I hacked that one with the air compression. And actually it was super quick. I mean, it took me a couple of hours. The biggest part was making the shopping list. And no, it was quite easy.
It's
but
a
now,
real,
unfortunately, it's out of the market.
this is that's just what I wanted to say, just as kind of a warning. But the same company make a slightly bigger machine that I have a friend, the glass blower, Charlie Stern in Stockholm. He's converted to the bigger machine. It's actually a better proportion, I think. So you know, I haven't done it personally, but it is possible. Yeah.
That's the machine I have, the Predator. So I want to start hacking my own 3D printer for clay. But at UCA, the digital lab I've set up, we use WASPs there, the Delta machines, which are really good. And I first used those at Domaine de Babouche, which ENSA came, which is in Limoges, ceramic school. And I first started working with them then, and the technicians that use them there. And that's why I decided to buy those for UCA, because of the contact time I'd had at Domaine de Babouche in France.
And Nico, what about your practice and your printer?
Yeah, I think I'm similar to Fred as well. I during my time at the Royal College of Art, I used the Lutum, and I've used it for a whole year. So I got very used to it, and I became I started to understand the machine very well and how it works. And so after I graduated, I had a fundraiser on a Kickstarter, and in order to sort of get money to be able to get a machine that I was so used to. And I'm not very, like, when it comes to, I'm not sure I'm able to build my own machine, you know, like, I'm very interested after hearing everyone say their experience, to be honest, but I sort of wanted to go to what was safe for me initially and keep using the Lutum. And the people who own it from V are also very helpful and very supportive. So I've had a very positive experience with my 3D printer.
Right. Now, Ryan, I think you're the unusual one in the group, the fact that you've built your own machines and you've also purchased them. So talk about your use of printers and what you've done to adapt them.
Yeah, sure. So I use a self-build Delta format at the moment, but purely for the fact that it's probably one of the early pieces that I came across from Jonathan's self-build. And I think both machines, the Lutum and probably the WASP or the Delta format, have pros and cons to both sides. I think the Lutum is probably better, more horizontal, as what Jonathan said earlier, wider pieces, and probably the Delta format is great for sort of taller pieces. But you need a bit more space to house it because they are so tall. But I think what it comes down to really is how you use the machine. I don't think it's too much about what the machine is. It's about how you use it and what you put through it, and again, that CAD design and pushing those boundaries.
Great. The next subject I want to talk about is education, higher education and 3D clay printing. Let's first start with the Royal College of Art. And three of you have masters from ceramics and glass, and also in product design, but using ceramics. So if Jonathan, Nico, and Heleen could please discuss RCA and their ceramics.
Well, it's my question really to Nico is that he did the course that I presented at Royal College of Art 2 years ago, and we see where he is now. That I think is just amazing, you know, and absolute congratulations for that. And if you could just say, you know, what it's taken, you know, what's required, strengths, weaknesses. Yeah.
So we had to sign up for a course, and I signed up for the 3D printing course with Jonathan, and I was very excited about it. Before I did, I don't come from an art background, you know. Like, initially I studied programming, and then I moved to fine arts, and then I did ceramics. So 3D printing was very exciting for me. It almost combined all these passions into one. So I signed up for the course, and I then made my own file, and I printed this like ugly pineapple looking thing. But I still saw potential, you know, like it was this new tool that allowed me to literally like spool or like extrude little snakes or little strings of lace, as I call them. And from then onwards, you know, like I didn't look back. I kept experimenting every day, pushing the machine to its extremes and see what I can take from it. You know, like failures became almost more important than successes in most cases, you know. And for me, I look at failures and try to utilize them not just as failures, but as switch them into something that's beautiful and harmonious. So yeah, I think it has been, you know, like it has been a long journey, but it also has been one that's full of experiments, and yeah, it has been great.
Great. Now, Heleen, your path at the RCA is a little bit different than most people, especially when they were using ceramic as the basis of their practice. Explain your RCA experience.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was, I constantly had to defend myself. Like, craft wasn't very welcome in design products, and even like digital craft wasn't really seen as innovation somehow. So in the end, I actually did everything outside RCA, and that's how I met Michelle. And Michelle really helped me and introduced me as well to the world of clay, and we immediately had a kind of spark, because she was also kind of very intrigued on digital crafts. But yeah, so basically, yeah, it was a bit insane. So I did all the CNC work in RCA, and then I took the wet clay on canvas, and I took a train 2 times a week to UCA, and that's where I met Michelle. And yeah, for me, it was a journey of 6 months, but before I had never touched clay. So for me, it was just a medium to kind of explore this new language. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to talk now about goldsmiths, and Fred, you can talk about, well, you didn't necessarily train at the goldsmith, but you work with the students in 3D printing.
Yeah, that's right. It was actually a PhD student who was centering his practice around printing clay that prompted the university to buy a clay printer in the first place, which I was really grateful of. Mm-hmm. But there was an element of concern. We didn't know what the uptake would be among the body of students. It's a fine art degree course at Goldsmiths rather than a dedicated ceramics and glass. And so Eva and I, Eva's that runs the 3D lab, regarded it possibly as a bit of a wild card. We didn't really know how we'd manage it necessarily or how many people would use it. But quite quickly, it became really popular. And certainly the fine art students at Goldsmiths have very experimental ideas. And I think Jonathan would agree, and many others who sort of work in the education side of things, a large part of the operation is actually managing what the limitations are of it. So students will quite often come with some quite kind of ambitious ideas, and fairly early on, you're trying to kind of communicate to them that there are limitations to what the technology can do. And as a technician, a lot of it is they are presenting forms. We're kind of looking at them in 3D space, and we're often telling them you can do this and this and this in a certain way, but you might have to scale back size or certain geometries in order to make it happen. But you know, the students have been really receptive to that, and a lot of the time you're printing objects which have infill because the geometry is a little bit too complex, and so you need some kind of internal structure or external structure support to help it build. So that's been our way of navigating students who have some really quite challenging projects which they bring to it and very little knowledge of how to actually execute that. It's been a good.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot going to degree shows. Scale is always an issue. There is ambition, but usually comes later with time and trial and error and experience.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the next one I'd like to talk is University of College of Arts in Farnham, and Michelle talk about you're working with 3D printing down there.
Yeah, before I started at UCA, I'd hacked into a broken printer in a technician role. And just like Jonathan said, saw a potential for shapes that you would never be able to make ordinarily, hand build or throw. And then I was slip casting from them, so making a plaster mold the PLA forms that I was 3D printing. And from there, I mean, I know the PLA is a kind of cornstarch, not a super nasty plastic, but I was, as a ceramicist, I was super interested in really embracing the ceramic printer. Because as you know, with clay, you know, you can infinitely recycle it without firing it. So it's just a really nice way of testing shapes, wedging them back up, putting them through the printer. So when I moved to UCA in Farnham, I wanted to embed a digital element within the department. And also where I did the residency at Grimsdyke Farm, which is an architectural university, Bartlett and RCA architecture, sort of embracing craft, really excited me. And then as a craftsperson, I really want to embrace the digital side of making. And as Jonathan Keeper said, you know, it just expands the parameters of what we can do and what we know has gone before. And it's another tool like a pottery wheel or a jigger-jolly machine. You know, it's just another tool for an expression. So I was very passionate about embedding that within UCA, within the ceramics and glass department.
And do many of the students take up the technology?
It's very fresh. So just before the lockdown was going to be the first project with using them. So actually they're still yet to be embraced by the students, which should be this next term, start of the term.
Right.